Have you ever wondered how certain things are made? Like for instance, maybe you watch a movie that has these incredible special effects and you wondered how in the world they made it. Like they look so realistic, you couldn't help but wonder what they did to make cars flip in the air, which I assume really are flipping in the air, things blowing up, which again, maybe things really are blowing up. These fighting sequences, alien invasions, these catastrophic natural disasters, these big typhoons that wipe out an entire city. Like, how do they make it look like that? Or maybe there's a food you love and you're like, man, how do they make that? Like chocolate. If I knew how to make chocolate, I'd be a happy person. Or maybe it's your favorite pizza. All you want to know is how did they make that? How do they make the dough taste so good? Because I want to make dough that tastes like that at home if you cook. Something else I'd love to know how it's made. A jetpack. Why? Because why not? Because it's called a jetpack. I just want to know how they make those things. Now, on the other hand, there are other things that for me, I'm not super excited to learn how they're made. Things like cheese. I love eating cheese. I don't really care to know anything else about it. Sandals. I've never lost sleep wondering, man, I wonder how sandals are made. Roads. Man, I am so grateful that we have these roads to drive on. They get us where we need to go. But I'm not necessarily pumped about the idea of learning the roadway creation process. Now, maybe you are. Maybe your list of things looks different, but no matter what you're curious about, one thing is typically true, although not always true, that once you learn how something is made, you just understand it better, right? Like let's say you go to a car plant to find out how cars are made, or to a newspaper plant to find out how the local paper is created. Now, even if you don't have the time of your life, even if you don't apply for a summer job at the local car plant, you still probably pay a little extra attention the next time you see a car passing by, the next time you see the local paper on the ground. You just give it a little extra focus because you understand more about how it was made. Now, for the next few weeks, we're gonna talk about this idea of made. And our goal is for you to know a little bit more about this idea so that you can better understand it and better understand how it relates to your very important life. So for the next 4 weeks, we're gonna be talking about how babies are made. I'm kidding. Sort of. Okay, now hopefully you already know the basics of how babies are made. If you don't know how babies are made, they're made at Walmart, okay? Now, if not, some of this may be a surprise, what we're talking about, but what we're talking about in this series is sex, okay? Yep, you heard me correctly. Now listen, I'm not stupid, so I know that as soon as you heard me say that this series is gonna be about sex, I know that a bunch of you all of a sudden wanna crawl under your seat and hide. You're like, really? Do we have to talk about this right now? Like really? No other topic we could cover? Now, a few of you are like, finally, we're gonna talk about something in church that is actually interesting. Some of you are like, ooh, gross. I don't wanna hear some adult talk to me about sex in church. And if that's you, don't worry. You get to talk about it in small group as well. Yep, okay. Now, I could be wrong, but I assume most of you already know something about this topic because you've been educated, either formally educated or just, the education of people talking by a teacher or a friend, a parent or older sibling, a movie, a song, the internet, personal experience. Okay, so let's not act like I just brought up sex and that it's a topic none of you have ever thought about, none of you have ever talked about, or none of you have ever heard anyone else talking about, okay? But still, I understand that it feels weird to talk about it in church, right? I get it. After all, isn't church the place where people tell you how wrong and evil it is? Isn't this the place where you hear about all the things that you should stay far away from? Sex being near the top of that list. Now, if you feel that way, I totally get it. But just as a favor to me, okay, I personally am gonna ask you to do just a couple of things today and throughout this series. Number one is to relax. Take a deep breath. This conversation about sex is gonna be different than you think. And it's not because it's gonna be super graphic, judgmental, or awkward. It's just gonna be different. So everybody just take a deep breath, okay? Number two, don't assume that you know what we're going to say. Just track with me and listen, please. That's all I'm asking. I promise I'm not gonna try to make you feel ashamed or grossed out. We just wanna talk about something that is already being talked about in almost every other area of your life. And we're like, hey, why doesn't the church get a chance to be in that conversation as well? Now, with that being said, I still, again, get the idea that talking about sex in church is weird. In fact, maybe you put up a guard as soon as I mention the word because it's so confusing to talk about. especially if you grew up in church or maybe you went to a Christian school, it's like an argument, right? There are always two different sides to this topic. Because on one hand, you have many adults who make it seem like sex is the worst sin you could ever commit. And on the other hand, you have culture. There's hip hop songs, okay, that make it seem like sex is the most casual thing ever. You watch one comedy movie and it's like, man, this isn't even a big deal at all. So how can one topic have such extreme viewpoints? Well, we're going to talk about that a lot throughout this series. But to start out today, I simply want to make two quick points. Number one, God made sex. God invented it. So if you've ever wanted to have sex, or if you are curious about sex, God's not mad at you or ashamed of you. You know what? God understands hormones. Seriously, God gets hormones, okay? Number two, God made you. And I know that sounds pretty basic and something many of you may already know, but this is something we're going to talk about a lot in this series because the decisions you make when it comes to sex are almost always connected to how you see you. And that's why we're starting with this truth. God made you. In fact, scripture says it this way, and this is the psalmist talking to God. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. So don't skip over this. God did a good job when he made you. And he also did a good job when he invented sex. Okay? God made sex, God made you. Now, this sounds nice, but I will say it again, that the idea doesn't make the topic any less awkward or confusing. And what do these two ideas have to do with each other? And that's where we're going to spend the rest of our time today. And we're going to look at a passage of scripture in Matthew from one of the most popular speeches Jesus ever gave, called the Sermon on the Mount. It was actually short for Sermon on the Mountain. So they really chopped it down there. But at the time Jesus gave this message, he was starting to gain some popularity. And he was teaching some bold, some challenging things, some confusing things. But more than that, people were trying to figure out where Jesus was so he could potentially heal them. So you can imagine the kind of crowds that showed up when Jesus came to town. They're like, will you heal this? My shoulder, my heart, my life, all of these things going on. So everywhere Jesus went, crowds followed. And this particular day, Jesus sat down on the side of a hill to start teaching. And he talked about how people should live and how people should treat each other. And just like he did with almost anything that he talked about, Jesus was flipping the script on the way things had been viewed previously. And he kept saying things like, you have heard it said, but I say. You have heard it said this thing, but I say this other thing. Jesus was saying a lot of things like that. So he was challenging what they had been taught, and he was introducing a new way for them to live in many areas of their lives. And this is what Jesus said about sex. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. That's how this part starts. So the first part of that verse was important. You have heard it said, Jesus starts. People in the crowd would have been familiar with the 10 commandments, so they would know commandment number 7, you shall not commit adultery, meaning don't have sex with somebody else's husband or wife. And they'd all be like, got it, check, yep, we've heard that, totally understand. But then Jesus adds something. And when Jesus said what he said next, you better believe it shook things up. Because I imagine some people were like, I walked all the way out here to get my knee healed. And by the way, it's not easy to walk out here with a bad knee, and I didn't show up to hear the adultery speech. So what Jesus added, however, had to do with more than just sex. He said, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. Again, everybody was like, got it, check. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Whoa, people were like, wow, that was different. I'm sure it went totally silent over on the side of the mountain as Jesus said this. But to just say, don't commit adultery is saying, don't have sex before you're supposed to with someone you're not supposed to. That's all about behavior, actions, choices, things we are doing on the outside, following the law, obeying the rules. But then Jesus added what we look at and what we think about to the equation. In other words, Jesus expanded the definition of what sex is. In other words, up to this point, most people had a limited view of sex. Sex was an act, a behavior, and nothing more. But the problem, Jesus is saying, is that there's more to it than that. When we see sex only as an act, only as behavior, and leave out the thoughts, leave out the heart, leave out the emotions, we're missing something. But why would Jesus bring up the issue of our hearts and what we think about when talking about a behavioral decision like sex? Well, obviously, because he cares about our hearts. because he cares about our thoughts. He cares about our emotions. This wasn't Jesus' way of saying, you thought God was just mad at you if you have sex. I'm telling you, he's mad at you for even thinking about it. No. This was Jesus' way of saying how you see the world and how you see each other will either make life better or worse for both of you. And I want more for you. Why? Because I love you. Now, maybe you noticed that Jesus talked about looking at a woman lustfully. And that's pretty specific, and maybe it sounds weird because it's not like people don't ever look at guys lustfully. If I was a guy, I'd be like, hey, what's up, man? Of course they do. But there was a reason why he focused on women, especially when he said that. Because they lived in a culture that treated women as property, as objects. Women existed for men. They could be used and discarded. Their purpose was to have children, preferably boys, so the boys could carry on the family name. Outside of that, women were instructed to stay indoors and stay out of the way. So when Jesus says this about looking at women lustfully, he is making more than a statement about sex or even about thinking about sex, more than just about our heart and emotions. He's making a statement about how you see other people. He's addressing the way women should be viewed and treated. He is elevating their worth. So this isn't just a sermon about avoiding sex. It's not just a sermon to men about their hearts. It's a sermon about the way people view and treat people. See, sex doesn't just start with our behavior. It starts with the value we see in each other. And to our culture today, it's a reminder to guys and girls alike that others weren't made to be objects. Others weren't made to be objects. You know what counts as an object? A Lunchable, a pair of headphones, a t-shirt, a gas station slushie, a math workbook. All of those things are objects or products for you to consume or read. They are made for you to use, and when you're done with them, they can be thrown away. And I think Jesus is saying, hey, people aren't objects. People aren't in that category. Objects are to be used. People are to be valued. Now, with that being said, think all the way back to the verse from Psalms that we mentioned earlier. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. Remembering that, like with that in mind, doesn't it make sense that Jesus would care about the way we look at each other? We're fearfully and wonderfully made, and looking at someone lustfully doesn't honor how they were made. It makes them an object. So of course Jesus would talk about more than just the act of sex, because we're fearfully and wonderfully made. Our thoughts about other people, our emotions about other people, and about ourselves should reflect that idea. But what does this mean? What does this mean for you and I? It means, I think, one practical thing is that there's a question to ask yourself when it comes to anything sex related. Am I treating them like a product or a person? Let me say that again. Am I treating them like a product or a person? Will this make them an object in my mind, or will this be an act of me honoring them? When you treat someone like an object or a product, it's all about you and what you want. Even if you don't mean to, you're using someone for your own enjoyment. When you value, it's all about the other person and what's best for their future. For example, when you're tempted to ask somebody to send you or text you an inappropriate picture, ask yourself, would this be using them or valuing them? When people are talking about somebody in the locker room in an inappropriate way and you're tempted to jump in, you just need to ask, am I talking about them like someone I would use or somebody I would value? When you're tempted to pressure your boyfriend or girlfriend to go further physically, ask yourself, am I using them or valuing their future? When you're tempted to go to websites where people are allowing themselves to be objectified, ask yourself, am I using this person like a product or valuing them like a person? Because people in porn videos are real people too. When you're tempted to do something sexual with somebody as a way of keeping them interested in you or keeping the relationship together, ask yourself, am I using them to get what I want or am I valuing what they want? When you're tempted to think about somebody only in a sexual way, ask yourself, am I thinking about them like an object I use or a person I value? See, this isn't about you having to stay away from something you want. God didn't make sex just to torture you, okay? God made it specifically for the context of marriage because marriage has the most potential for sex to be valuing and not objectifying. Because God places huge value on you and he doesn't want you to be treated like an object. And at the same time, he places huge value on other people and doesn't want them to be treated as objects. He's not out to guilt you or shame you, but to remind you that all of us were made to be more than objects. And when we start seeing one another that way, we'll begin treating one another that way. And in turn, we'll make better decisions when it comes to sex and relationships. because you are fearfully and wonderfully made. So is everybody else. So view each other as valuable, not as objects.